So I wanted to talk about securing Synapse because we've all been in the position where we're doing all this code and then we need to give people access to it. And then recently I've had a number of different conversations with different clients about what do I do this? What do I grant that? And so I figured that I would just do a session to answer some of these questions. And this is not going to be enough because as any of you who have been playing around with security know, this can be complicated because like many different Microsoft tools, there's more than one way of granting security. So, and there's a little bit of, there's some complete overlap and then there's some that it's not. So I'll cover it so that you know, if anything, where to look at. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about is different ways to support your Synapse environment by looking at logging and monitoring, and a really cool tool that I found. So with that, a little bit about me. My name is Ginger Grant. I am a data platform MVP. And if you want to get a hold of me after this because you can't remember about some questions that you wanted to ask me, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Be happy to respond to any questions that you don't remember to put in chat now. All right. And with that, let's get started talking about security. Whoops. So there's a number of different places that you can choose to perform security. Of course, there's a Synapse UI. Then the Synapse UI can control a lot of the different granular elements that you will need to give people the authority to do different elements in your security. You're going to want to be owner or contributor on the resource group, though, to be able to do that. So outside of the UI, remember that you are going to need resource group permissions as well. And then there's also data security. I mean, one of the reasons that you create a data lake in a hierarchical structure is so that you have a lot of different levels and you can grant people the ability to read those or not, given your desires and what those folders contain. And then I wanted to talk about different ways that you can log how your code is being run and looking at different ways of doing a monitoring of that. So the other thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't put on the slide, but it's definitely something that is in your security environment, is you're going to want to make sure that you have your GitHub or Azure DevOps configuration set up as well. That's technically not part of Synapse security, but yet it is, because if you're talking about people who you want to have the ability to create and save code, you're going to need to handle that as well. So don't forget about your source control administration when you're talking about security administration. So there's a whole bunch of things to secure. You want to make sure that you've got Synapse roles, then that will help people who are accessing code and the ability to execute it. You'll want to make sure that you've got Git permissions. You can actually create a Git permission that allows people to do a whole bunch of stuff and not save. So you could grant somebody that in kind of a separate reader role capability so that they could look at code, they could execute code, but they couldn't change anything. So you've got that option for you as well when it comes to Git permissions. And then there's, of course, Azure roles, and these are for different resource management and access to your storage data. So if you want to restrict your data lake, that's probably where you're going to be wanting to do it. And then don't forget, of course, SQL roles, because if you are just giving people the ability to access your serverless pool, they don't need to have a Synapse role. This was a shock to a client that I talked to recently. So if your goal with your Synapse environment is to create a serverless database that perhaps people use to connect to Power BI, then you're going to need to grant SQL roles, because a serverless, and I'm not talking dedicated primarily because I don't do much with it. So I'm kind of focusing here today on anything that's not dedicated, because there is a whole security and structure around dedicated, and I'm just not going to talk about it today because I don't use it. So, and that's one thing that I wanted to bring up as well. So about data rights, if you're looking for your Azure Data Lake security, you're looking at contributor, owner, reader, and then of course storage blob, data contributor, and access reader and access administrator. The one thing that I wanted to bring up for ADLS is for non-developers. They don't need reader rights on the entire ADLS resource. They probably just need access to certain folder structure that you have. If you're doing any work, you do need storage blob, data contributor. I was recently working with a client, funny enough, that I was supposed to be in this group. So it looked like that I had the security rights that I was supposed to, but I didn't have storage blob, data contributor. And I got the weirdest error, but I was a Synapse administrator, and I got the weirdest error when I was trying to run some Python code. So just keep that in mind, because the errors that you get if you don't have some of this are very odd. And I would not have guessed the error was something like, inability to read data. And I'm like, what? What do you mean I can't read the data? And it was because I didn't have storage blob data. I should write the data. I didn't have storage blob data contributor. So very interesting kind of things that you can end up. And then if you have user access administrator, you can grant people that too. Now, Synapse Serverless Administration is something that I've not heard anybody, particularly discuss, but more and more I see that as something that people are going to want to grant their users. If you are an administrator, you don't have to worry about anything, because you could automatically receive the permissions to a serverless database. But if you have users, you want to grant people the same way as a SQL DB. And there's also another trick for looking at serverless databases. So I just wanted to look at that here very quickly, because I know this is getting to be a very popular topic. So looking at my environment here, if I'm interested in accessing my serverless database, if we look here within Synapse, we see that I have several different databases that I've got here. And if I want to just give somebody the ability to access my serverless databases that I've already created, I can go in here and I can use the SQL admin user. So this is kind of like SA in my environment. So if we look here within Synapse, let's drag this over. Looking at here in Management Studio, you can see that this is my on-demand Azure SQL Synapse here, which is, of course, what I'm using here is looking at my endpoint here. So just grab your endpoint and connect to it. And you can always connect using this admin user and their username. And if you don't remember what somebody said it, you can always reset that as well. So if we're looking, and as an administrator, you'd be like, well, it works fine for me. What about you? I don't understand about you people. This ID is all automatically created. So the SQL admin user is created. And I don't have a specific login that you see here, because I'm just been granted rights. Now, I do have, say, a user that I want to have the ability to access data that is in my databases. So what I'm going to do is basically create a login to her. Ideally, of course, you would have groups. I've got a little bit of a smaller environment, so it's not exactly going to work the same way. But so I'm granting Renee the ability to read the data in the database, granting her SQL State Reader. So then if Renee wants to log in with her password, then she can go ahead and access any of the data that way as well. So for majority of your users now, Renee doesn't necessarily have to have any access to the underlying data where this is contained. So she doesn't. I have, of course, this is all on my Azure Data Lake information, and Renee has no rights to that. but she can still access the data because I've given her reader roles, which is really what you would need to do if your goal is to create a database that most people can use. They don't need to be able to do anything other than just read the data that you've got. If you're connecting to Power BI, of course, you can grant people greater roles, but remember, you can do this, and this is completely independent from your Synapse environment. So SQL rules still apply, even though, as I continually tell my clients, this isn't really a database. It's just a data lake that I have data on top of. So, and you can then take a look at all of your different tables and that you've got in here. And of course, external resources, external tables, they can all be accessed by somebody with these permissions. Okay, let's go in to talk about more Synapse RBAC roles. So there's different ways that you can grant people rights to access different elements. Of course, if you're the Synapse administrator, that pretty much gives you everything that you need to access things within Synapse. But there are RBAC roles that are functionally equivalent, and things like compute resource management, workspace owner, and contributor. Now, remember, when you are changing around rights within Synapse, this is going to take probably 10 minutes for groups to work. So don't expect to change it and then someone say, no, go try it right now. Give them 10 minutes. Otherwise, you may not have access to the information that you're looking for. So keep that in mind when you're doing it. So within Synapse Security, you're going to want to go to Security and Access Control to grant your workspace permissions. And these can be pretty granular, and they work in conjunction with Azure roles. And I went ahead and clipped what you see so you get the whole list of different role assignments that you get under Access Control. Notice, so this is the entire list. So notice that you've got a Synapse administrator, a SQL administrator, and a Spark administrator. So these roles pretty much grant people the ability to operate in those different functions. Now, when they're talking about a SQL administrator here, this is primarily designed for people who are doing things with dedicated SQL pools. So the ability to create dedicated pools, etc. That's what your SQL administrator is. Now, I would think that for a lot of environments, you could give people Spark administrator roles, and that would cover a lot of different elements for people to be able to access them. Artifacts, these are different reader rights. The artifact is tied a lot to KQL. So if you're doing a lot with KQL, then you're going to want to look at artifact user and publisher rights. Contributor, let's take a look at the other main roles. When the main Synapse roles are administrator, contributor, and users, because these other ones are all have specific elements assigned to them. So let's look at the major roles, and starting, of course, with a user. So if you are a Synapse user, you can take a look at the pools, and then you can see the list. You can see the list of link services. You can take a look at monitoring Spark, and you can create SQL scripts, notebooks, and pipelines, and execute pipelines and create a trigger. Notice you don't have any ability to create anything. You don't have the ability to create link services. You don't have the ability to create to execute notebooks per se, but you can execute pipelines and create triggers with pipelines. So if you are a contributor, then you start getting more rights. If you're a contributor, then you can start creating and pausing dedicated pools, which a user can't do. You can create SQL scripts, notebooks. So the additional features that you get with contributors are really pool-based access to be able to do that, and you can publish a SQL script. So you can't even so with user you can't even do that. So of course with logging, that's available with inside and outside of Synapse, and you can increase this by installing Log Analytics that allows you to have a lot more different rights that you can do. So if you're looking at Spark pool monitoring, you can look at monitoring the applications that when they're running within Monitor, and then taking a look at what is running while it's going on. If they're succeeded, you get different elements, but within the Spark pool monitoring, you can then see what's going on in real time and also take a look at the Libby executions as well. So this is basically taking a look at the different elements within it, looking at the logging, what's applying, and seeing the list for different stages. The next thing that I wanted to really review is something that I don't think that a lot of people have talked about, and that is the Azure Synapse Toolbox. And I don't know that anybody has necessarily heard a lot about this particular Microsoft GitHub resource, but it's a really cool open source Microsoft container that's got a lot of different Azure tools. So let's take a look at that. So if we're looking at Azure Toolbox, it's got a lot of really cool stuff that you might find interesting that will allow you to look at different elements within Azure Synapse. So if you're looking to looking at graph queries, it contains a way that you can just look at the inventory of your dedicated pool. So you can take a look at these K-cool queries to do that. So you can run these again within Synapse. So notice here it tells you that you need to have, RBAC reader or Synapse readers, and then you can take a look at running these different queries within that. But one thing that I wanted to bring up specifically is, of course, Log Analytics. Now, if you go ahead and install Log Analytics as a separate Azure component, then you're going to need to do that to be able to access these different elements. So first, you want to make sure that you are logging your using Log Analytics, and then you can have some pretty in-depth way of looking at the data that's contained within it. So I can take a look at my completed pipelines and the longest running different pipelines once I've got Log Analytics specified. So I've got a lot more information that I can provide when I've got that added to it. So it gives me a much greater analysis of my data that's available to me if I log that Log Analytics. And I can also take a look at dedicated pools if I wanted to, and then taking a look at different monitoring of my Synapse work with Synapse workbooks. So if I did have dedicated pools, this I could load up this notebook that'll allow me to monitor what's going on with this notebook. So you're going to use this pool template to do that, allowing you to get a really good idea of what's going on in your failure rate, etc. And of course, this includes the fact that you need to have Log Analytics. So I know that a lot of people probably haven't taken a look at, incorporation of Log Analytics in terms of Azure Synapse. I want to make sure that you have access to this. In terms of Synapse, but it's really with this particular toolbox, there's a lot of information that's being provided to you that allows you to have a more in-depth look at what's going on internally once you have Log Analytics in your Azure environment. So basically what you're going to want to do is within Azure, just add Log Analytics. And here, when it's looking at the different workspaces, that's what it's talking about. So I want to go ahead. Actually, that's not what I wanted to do. Got one in here somewhere. So basically, I can go ahead and add that to my different environments. So I'm just going to create this Log Analytics workspace for Synapse. And one thing that you're going to want to start monitoring with this too is though you are charged based on how much data that you have. So think about how much you are going to want to be saving this, and then look at monitoring that over time. So then you have the ability to take a look at more in-depth ways that it's going to be created. So make sure you've got this workspace created, and then you're going to want to send your SQL request to Log Analytics, and then you can just basically create your new workbook, and then paste the JSON contents to do that. So you can also add additional contents. There's, of course, a workbook for Spark, which is really helpful for monitoring that ongoing. So this workbook will then allow you to take a look at what's going on with Spark, looking at, for example, how your different executors are running, taking a look at how long it's taking for the different components to run, and then taking a look also at your storage accounts. All of your storage accounts, how they're in use, how they're being queued, how your different jobs are accessing them, and looking at your availability and use capacity over time. So in addition to, everything that you can get within Synapse already, this particular toolbook, which I'll give Ike Ellis credit because he was the one that let me know that this even existed. But it really provides a much richer environment for all of your different Synapse elements to be able to do that. And of course, because you have the capability of Azure Data Factory with Synapse, it's monitoring those too. So no matter how you wrote it. But with serverless, this can take a look at your query execution in terms of costing. How many people have wondered, shoot, how much did that query cost me, or how much is it ongoing, those queries ongoing, going to be running? And this is really the only way that I know that you can find that out. So taking a look at how much has been processed, looking at the number of counts of queries, and then something that you never see anywhere else when it comes to serverless, and that's looking at this approximate cumulative cost. And I can't tell you how many people that have asked me, it's like, well, how do I know how much I'm going to be using for Synapse doing the queries? And I'm like, well, it's $5 a terabyte. How much can it kill you? But this can actually show you what your execution costs of different queries are. And of course, if you know what the queries are, then you can take a look at who's running them and all that good stuff as well. So looking at, the different queries being run, and this, if you'll notice here from the example, this is just all the auto-generated stuff too. So, oops, what the heck I just did? There we go. I was trying to make this a little bit bigger. So you can see exactly what was run, how many megabytes it actually processed, the query count, the hash, and the cost. So you can see, what the total cost, and then per user. So here we can see what Nick's been up to and how much he's costing us versus somebody else. So this gives you the ability to take a look at all the information on even a per user basis to see what the cost is for different serverless elements. So you can now take a look at what's going on with serverless at a really granular level, which is not something that's really available in other environments. So again, so what I need to do is make sure that I've got my Log Analytics workspace created, which I thought I just did. And again, this is all about how long you retain the data so that you can do it. Obviously, it's very simple to be able to execute. That we'll get this loaded here when that's complete. But this is a in addition to, so we'll take a look at this toolbox as soon as I've got my environment set up to do that. But there's a lot of different elements within here that are going to also help you as well. So looking at Power BI, so this is something that's still in process. But looking at different T-SQL queries, to taking a look at the different environments you might want to look at, looking at current activity, reading Delta Lake, taking a look at what you've got going on within your environment. A lot of good stuff within here, and I don't think Microsoft has done a pretty good the ability to do this. The other thing here within serverless, if you're looking at just you want to run that, how much is your cost per query element? If we take a look at this is just running a query looking for how much anything has been processing. So you can run this query in your serverless environments just to see how long that's been running. So since I'm waiting for that thing to load, so let's take a look at this. So this is showing that, the different queries based on who's done it, looking at how much the cost is. So if you want to do this separate and just within serverless, you can do this as well without having log analytics. So taking a look at, the different, how long that took, what the cost is, what the command was. So this is obviously something that if you were ever wondering it, this is how you can find it out. And frankly, this is something that all my clients are very happy that they know that exists. So take a look at this. Now you can answer that question, what's going on in serverless, which is kind of different from all the different elements that I know that are there for dedicated pools, but don't seem to be so much for serverless, but there is some help with that. All right, so taking a look at my environment now. So I've got my Log Analytics Synapse workspace created. So now that what I can do is go ahead and connect to my data source, look at my different monitoring solutions and start monitoring the different health, and then go to my different Toolbox. Didn't want to be in T-SQL right now. Log Analytics queries, and start looking at the different pipelines once I've started doing that, so that I can log. Once I've got it pointed to Synapse so that it can start logging it, then I can start running these KQL queries against it so that I can see what's going on in a real-time fashion when it comes to, say, pipelines. So this gives me additional functionality over and above what is standard within Azure, so within Synapse, excuse me. So what I want to do is I want to then, of course, connect to my data source and configuring my monitor machines. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to my storage account log. I'm going to go ahead and add my storage account for this, and this is my existing storage account. I want to take a look at my events. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now that I've added my data set, now it's going to start gathering information so that I can start monitoring using Log Analytics. Any questions? I highly recommend check this stuff out, because there's really great stuff in the toolbox, and you're going to find stuff in here that I'm sure that you're going to find useful in monitoring your environments. And it's not just for not just for dedicated, which is kind of nice. I mean, this query alone has been really helpful in a lot of questions that I've been received, and frankly, I did not know how to do those. So